Get out of first class before I call security. The words cracked through the cabin so sharply that conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Even the soft hum of pre-boarding seemed to fade beneath the weight of what had just been said. Standing in the aisle of Aerolux Flight 227, scheduled to depart New York for Los Angeles at exactly 6:15 p.m., Marcus Whitfield didn't move. He simply looked at the woman who had said it. Claire Donovan, the lead flight attendant, stood with her arms folded tightly across her Navy uniform. Her expression wasn't confused. It wasn't uncertain. It was certain. Certain that the tall black man wearing a black hoodie, dark jeans, and white sneakers didn't belong in first class. The boarding pass in Marcus's hand didn't seem to matter. The identification he had calmly presented moments earlier didn't seem to matter either. Claire's eyes had already made their decision long before she looked at either one. Around them, passengers watched carefully. Some pretended not to stare. Others made no effort to hide it. Marcus could feel the familiar weight of judgment settling across the cabin like a heavy blanket. It wasn't new. He had felt it before. Many times. Yet somehow had always managed to arrive wearing a different face. Claire stepped closer. "Sir, I'm not repeating myself again." Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers." Marcus lowered his eyes briefly to the boarding pass. Seat 1A. The same seat he had personally selected 3 weeks earlier. The same seat reflected inside Aerolux's reservation system. The same seat his ticket clearly displayed. Then he looked back at Claire. "It is my seat," he said calmly. No anger, no raised voice. Just fact. That seemed to irritate her even more. A younger flight attendant standing several feet behind her exchanged a nervous glance with another crew member. Neither spoke. Neither intervened. Claire gave a short laugh that carried more judgment than humor. Then maybe someone made a mistake. Marcus studied the cabin around him. Leather seats, soft lighting, polished service counters. Everything looked exactly the way Aerolux marketing promised customers it would. Premium, exclusive, refined. Yet beneath the polished surface, something else was beginning to show itself. Something far uglier. Across the aisle, a woman in her late 20s slowly lowered her phone from her lap and watched. 2 businessmen near the front exchanged quiet whispers. A man in row 3 glanced from Marcus to Claire and back again. Nobody knew who Marcus Whitfield really was. Nobody knew that the airline they were sitting inside existed partly because of a signature he had placed on a contract 2 years earlier. Nobody knew that he owned more shares of Aerolux Airways than anyone else on Earth. And Marcus preferred it that way. In fact, that was exactly why he was here. He wasn't traveling to Los Angeles for business. He wasn't attending a conference. He wasn't meeting investors. He was investigating his own company. For months, complaints had arrived on his desk describing passengers who felt dismissed, profiled, or treated differently based on appearance. Most executives would have delegated the issue. Marcus chose something else. He decided to see it for himself. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the test would reveal the truth. Claire extended her hand toward the boarding pass. "Last chance," she said. "Either move to economy or leave the aircraft." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. The cabin wasn't quiet anymore. It was charged. Every eye seemed fixed on the confrontation unfolding near seat 1A. Then Marcus slipped his boarding pass back into his pocket. His expression never changed. His voice remained steady. "You're making a very expensive mistake." For the first time, several passengers glanced at one another. Something in the way he said it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like certainty. And 30 minutes later, everyone on that aircraft would understand exactly why. Claire Donovan stared at Marcus Whitfield as if the conversation were already over. Around them, passengers shifted in their seats, sensing that something unusual was unfolding before the aircraft had even left the gate. Marcus remained exactly where he was. Calm, unmoved, almost detached. That calmness bothered Claire more than any argument could have. Most people became defensive when challenged. Most people tried to explain themselves. Marcus didn't either. What nobody inside the cabin knew was that this flight had never been about getting to Los Angeles. Marcus could have flown private. He owned aircraft that cost more than some regional airlines earned in a year. He could have avoided crowded terminals, security lines, and delayed departures forever if he wanted. But that was not why he was here. 6 months earlier, a stack of customer complaints had landed on his desk at Aerolux headquarters in Chicago. Individually, they seemed small. A passenger ignored during boarding. A traveler questioned repeatedly despite presenting valid documents. A family treated differently than others seated nearby. None of the reports alone seemed catastrophic. Together, they formed a pattern, one that Marcus could not ignore. Every report described the same thing: people being judged before they were helped, appearance becoming more important than policy, assumptions replacing professionalism. The company had opened investigations. Managers had submitted reports. Consultants had presented findings. Yet Marcus trusted something else more than paperwork: experience. So he decided to experience the airline exactly the way an ordinary customer would. No executive team, no security detail, no announcements, no special treatment. Just a ticket purchased under his real name and a seat in first class. Earlier that afternoon, he had walked through Terminal B carrying a small black backpack. Nobody recognized him. He stopped for coffee, waited in line, sat beside other travelers near the gate. Everything had seemed normal. Then boarding began. Within minutes, the entire situation changed. Marcus glanced toward the cabin windows. Outside, airport vehicles moved beneath the evening sunlight. Baggage crews finished loading containers into the aircraft belly. The world beyond the glass looked orderly, predictable. Inside the cabin, however, something entirely different was taking shape. Claire believed she was protecting the image of first class. Marcus understood she was exposing something much larger. A younger flight attendant named Jordan Ellis stood near the galley entrance. His eyes moved repeatedly between Claire and the handheld boarding scanner hanging at his side. He had seen the green confirmation earlier. He knew the ticket was valid. Yet he remained silent. Not because he agreed, because speaking up against senior crew members carried consequences. Marcus noticed him immediately. Fear had a way of making people quiet. Across the aisle, the woman who had been watching from row 2 slowly unlocked her phone again. Her name was Emily Brooks, a marketing executive from Denver, traveling home after a conference in Manhattan. She had witnessed enough uncomfortable moments in airports to recognize one when she saw it. Something about this interaction felt wrong. Claire was treating certainty like evidence. Marcus finally looked back at her. She was still waiting for him to stand and leave. Instead, he simply settled deeper in his seat 1A and folded his hands. The gesture was small, almost invisible. It changed the energy inside the cabin. Because for the first time, Claire realized she was not dealing with someone who intended to surrender the moment she raised her voice. And somewhere far above the clouds they had not yet reached, a very different outcome was already beginning to take shape. The silence inside the cabin lasted only a few seconds before Claire Donovan decided to escalate. People who were uncertain usually asked questions. People who were confident checked facts. Claire did neither. Instead, she turned toward the front galley and motioned for another crew member to join her. Moments later, Brian Keller appeared. Tall, polished, and wearing the same Navy uniform. He approached with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed he already understood the situation. Claire leaned close enough to speak quietly, but not quietly enough. Several nearby passengers still heard every word. "He is refusing to leave," she said. Brian looked Marcus up and down before he looked at the boarding pass. That detail did not escape anyone watching. "Sir," Brian said, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes, "economy is toward the rear of the aircraft." A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. Marcus remained seated. "My seat is here." Brian extended his hand. "Let me see the ticket." Marcus handed it over without hesitation. Brian studied it for barely a second. Then he glanced toward Claire. The exchange was subtle, but it carried an unmistakable message. Neither of them seemed interested in verifying anything. They were looking for confirmation of an assumption they had already made. "Interesting," Brian said. "This does not seem right." Marcus folded his hands again. What exactly does not seem right? Brian hesitated, not because he lacked an answer, because the honest answer would have sounded much worse out loud. Claire stepped in before he could respond. There are inconsistencies. Marcus looked directly at her. Name one. For the first time, Claire's confidence flickered. Only slightly. Just enough for Emily Brooks to notice from row 2. She had spent years working in corporate marketing. She knew what confidence looked like. She also knew what bluffing looked like. And right now, Claire appeared to be running out of facts. Brian pulled out a company tablet and began scrolling through passenger records. The screen reflected against his glasses. Marcus noticed something immediately. Brian never entered the reservation number. He never searched the booking. He was performing certainty rather than investigation. The difference mattered. Jordan Ellis noticed it too. Standing near the galley, he watched the interaction unfold with growing concern. Earlier, he had personally seen the boarding scanner flash green when Marcus entered the aircraft. A green scan meant one thing: authorized passenger, valid seat assignment. End of discussion. Yet somehow the discussion continued. Brian finally lowered the tablet and sighed dramatically. There appears to be an issue with the reservation. Marcus nodded slowly, then pulled the booking record. Brian did not move. That will not be necessary. Several passengers exchanged glances. The atmosphere was changing. What had initially looked like a misunderstanding was beginning to resemble something else entirely. Something more deliberate. Claire folded her arms again. Sir, you are delaying departure. Marcus almost smiled. Not because the situation was amusing, because he recognized the pattern. When evidence failed, pressure replaced it. When facts disappeared, authority took their place. He had seen it before. Boardrooms, hotels, private clubs, airports, different locations. Same script. Across the aisle, Emily quietly unlocked her phone camera. She was not recording yet. Not officially, but instinct told her she might need it soon. Then Brian looked toward the boarding door and spoke the words that changed everything. Maybe we should bring the captain into this. Claire nodded immediately. The decision came far too quickly, as though both of them had been waiting for permission to escalate. Marcus leaned back in seat 1A and looked toward the front of the aircraft. The test was revealing more than he expected, and it was only getting started. Less than 3 minutes remained before the scheduled departure. Yet the aircraft felt farther from takeoff than ever. Claire Donovan stood near the front galley with the confidence of someone who believed authority alone could settle the matter. Marcus Whitfield remained seated in 1A. Calm, patient, unmoved. The contrast between them was becoming impossible to ignore. Brian Keller glanced toward the boarding door, expecting support to arrive at any moment. Instead, the silence continued to stretch across the first-class cabin. It was the kind of silence that made people pay attention, the kind that exposed who was acting on facts and who was acting on assumptions. Claire finally broke it. Why are you making this difficult? She asked. Marcus looked at her for a moment before answering. I am not making anything difficult. I presented a valid ticket. Claire shook her head. You know what I mean? Marcus didn't know what she meant. The problem was that neither Claire nor Brian seemed willing to say it directly. Across the aisle, Emily Brooks watched the exchange carefully. Every minute that passed made the situation harder to explain as a simple misunderstanding. If there had truly been an issue with the reservation, someone would have verified it by now. Instead, the crew kept repeating conclusions without producing evidence. Jordan Ellis remained near the galley entrance. His stomach tightened with every passing second. He had joined Aerolux because he believed customer service mattered. He believed professionalism mattered. Yet what he was witnessing felt like neither. He looked once more at the scanner clipped to his belt. He still remembered the green confirmation that had flashed when Marcus boarded. The image refused to leave his mind. Claire suddenly stepped closer to Marcus's seat. Sir, I am asking you one final time to relocate. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply replied, scan it again. The words landed with surprising force. Scan it again. Not an excuse. Not a complaint. Just a request for verification. Claire's jaw tightened. Brian looked away. Neither moved toward the scanner. Neither reached for the reservation system. The request itself seemed to make them uncomfortable, because if the ticket was scanned again, the discussion might end, and neither of them appeared interested in ending it that way. Marcus settled back into the leather seat. The cabin lights reflected softly against the windows beside him. From the outside, he looked completely relaxed. Inside, he was observing everything. Every word, every reaction, every decision. This was no longer about a seat assignment. It was about culture, about judgment, about what happened when perception became more powerful than policy. Emily noticed another passenger several rows back, quietly listening now. Then another. The audience was growing, not because Marcus was creating a scene, but because he was not. His composure forced everyone else to reveal themselves. Claire folded her arms. "You're delaying this flight." Marcus met her eyes. "No, the truth is delaying this flight." For the first time, Claire had no immediate response. The air inside the cabin felt charged, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon. And somewhere beyond the boarding door, footsteps were approaching. The captain had finally been called. What happened next would determine whether this remained a customer service problem or became something much bigger. The boarding door remained open, but nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. The attention of the cabin had shifted entirely toward the unfolding confrontation near seat 1A. What had started as an uncomfortable exchange was becoming something larger. People were no longer pretending not to notice. They were watching, listening, judging for themselves. Captain Robert Hayes finally appeared from the cockpit, tall, composed, and carrying the authority that came with decades in aviation. He walked toward the front of first class with measured steps. Claire Donovan immediately straightened her posture. Relief flashed across her face. The backup she had been waiting for had arrived. Brian Keller moved beside her. Neither seemed concerned about the facts. They appeared concerned about control. Captain Hayes stopped beside them. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked. Claire answered before anyone else could speak. "We have a passenger refusing crew instructions." The captain nodded slowly and looked toward Marcus. "Sir, is that accurate?" Marcus met his gaze. "No, I presented a valid ticket for this seat and requested verification." Captain Hayes glanced toward Claire, then toward Brian, then back toward Marcus. The pause lasted only a second, but Emily Brooks noticed something important. The captain never asked to see the ticket. He never requested the reservation record. He never asked Jordan what the scanner had shown. Instead, he appeared to be evaluating the situation through the lens already provided to him. Jordan felt his chest tighten. The opportunity to correct the narrative was slipping away. "Captain," Claire continued, "he is delaying departure and making passengers uncomfortable." Several heads turned immediately. Uncomfortable? The word hung in the air, because nobody had seen Marcus raise his voice. Nobody had seen him argue. Nobody had seen him create a disturbance. In fact, the loudest voices in the cabin belonged to the crew. Emily exchanged a glance with a businessman seated across from her. He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. The silence itself was becoming a statement. Captain Hayes folded his hands behind his back. "Sir, I would appreciate your cooperation." Marcus remained seated. "I would appreciate verification." Again, the answer was calm, direct, impossible to misunderstand. Claire sighed dramatically. "We have already been through this." Marcus looked at her. "No, you have avoided it." The words landed heavily. Jordan lowered his eyes. Because they were true. The scanner had already answered the question. The system had already answered the question. Yet somehow the question remained open. Near the second row, Emily finally opened her camera application. She did not announce it. She simply prepared it. Something told her that this moment might matter later. Around the cabin, other passengers were beginning to exchange quiet comments. Not loud enough to disrupt, just enough to reveal a growing doubt. Captain Hayes noticed it too. The atmosphere had shifted. Confidence was slowly migrating away from the crew and toward the passenger sitting quietly in seat 1A. Then Jordan made a decision. Small decisions often change the direction of much larger events. He took a step forward from the galley entrance. Claire immediately noticed the movement. Brian did too. Both turned toward him. Jordan swallowed hard. His heart pounded, but he could no longer ignore what he knew. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Jordan finally opened his mouth, and the entire direction of the situation began to change. Jordan Ellis felt every eye in the front cabin shift toward him. The moment he stepped forward, the balance inside the aircraft changed. Claire Donovan's expression hardened immediately. Brian Keller looked annoyed. Captain Robert Hayes appeared surprised. Marcus Whitfield remained silent. He simply watched. Jordan cleared his throat. "Captain, I saw the boarding scan when he entered the aircraft." The words seemed to hang in the air. Nobody interrupted. Not at first. The system showed a valid confirmation. Jordan continued. Seat 1A. A ripple moved through the cabin. Small reactions. Raised eyebrows. Quiet whispers. Emily Brooks glanced up from her phone. Several passengers exchanged looks that said the same thing. Finally, someone was speaking about facts. Claire folded her arms tighter. "Jordan, you are new here," she said. "You probably misunderstood what you saw." Jordan swallowed. He had never challenged a senior crew member before. Yet something about the situation refused to let him stay silent. "I did not misunderstand," he replied carefully. The scanner displayed a valid boarding result. Brian stepped forward. Then there must have been a system error afterward. Marcus looked at him for the first time in several minutes. "Interesting," he said calmly. "Now the system was correct when it boarded me and incorrect after I sat down?" Brian avoided eye contact. The question landed harder than anyone expected, because it exposed the problem immediately. The explanations kept changing. The facts did not. Captain Hayes shifted his weight. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on his face. Jordan noticed it. So did Emily. The captain was beginning to realize he had entered a situation without understanding it fully. Claire sensed the shift and moved quickly to regain control. "Captain, this is not about the ticket anymore," she said. "It is about compliance. We asked him to relocate and he refused." Marcus looked out the window for a moment before responding. Compliance with what? The question cut through the cabin like a spotlight. Nobody answered immediately, because there was no policy requiring a passenger with a valid first-class ticket to surrender a valid first-class seat. The silence became uncomfortable. Claire looked toward the boarding door. Then something happened that made several passengers sit up straighter. A well-dressed white couple entered the cabin carrying premium amenity bags. Claire's expression brightened instantly. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," she said warmly. "Welcome aboard." The difference in tone was impossible to miss. Warm, friendly, effortless. The couple smiled and stepped into the first-class section. Then Claire glanced towards seat 1A. Just for a second, but everyone saw it. Marcus saw it too. Emily lowered her phone slightly. The implication was obvious. Claire had already decided who looked like they belonged in first class and who did not. Mr. Bennett noticed the tension immediately. "Everything all right?" he asked. Claire offered a rehearsed smile. "Just resolving a seating issue." A seating issue, not a verification issue, not a policy issue. A seating issue. Marcus almost smiled. The language kept changing because the truth remained stubbornly unchanged. Jordan felt his pulse quicken again. He had spoken up once. Now he realized the situation was growing larger than anyone expected. Around the cabin, passengers were no longer watching out of curiosity. They were watching because they wanted to know who was telling the truth. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the answer was becoming increasingly clear. The tension inside the cabin thickened the moment Claire Donovan made her next decision. Up until then, she had relied on assumptions, pressure, and authority. Now, she crossed into something else entirely. She looked toward the Bennetts and offered an apologetic smile. "Please bear with us," she said. "We are resolving a seating matter." Then she turned back toward Marcus Whitfield. "Sir, gather your belongings." The words landed like a verdict. Marcus remained seated. "Why?" Claire exhaled sharply. "Because that seat will not be available." Several passengers looked at one another. Even Captain Hayes appeared caught off guard. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "My ticket says otherwise." Claire ignored him. Instead, she gestured toward Brian Keller. Brian stepped forward and reached toward the overhead compartment above seat 1A. He removed Marcus's backpack and placed it in the aisle beside the seat. The movement was not aggressive. It did not need to be. The message was clear enough. They had already decided the outcome before proving their case. A quiet murmur spread through first class. Emily Brooks immediately lifted her phone and began recording. This time she did not hesitate. The situation had moved beyond misunderstanding. Across the cabin, another passenger pulled out his phone as well. Jordan Ellis stared in disbelief. "Brian," he said carefully, "the seat assignment has not changed." Brian pretended not to hear him. Claire motioned toward the Bennetts. "Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Bennett, we will have your seating arranged shortly." Richard Bennett looked uncomfortable. His wife looked even more uncomfortable. Neither moved toward seat 1A. They could feel what everyone else felt. Something about this was wrong. Marcus glanced down at his backpack, sitting alone in the aisle. For a brief moment, the entire cabin seemed frozen around that image. A paying passenger, a valid ticket, a confirmed seat, and yet his belongings had already been removed as if the decision had been finalized. Captain Hayes stepped closer. "Sir, I need your cooperation." Marcus slowly lifted his eyes. Cooperation with what? Again, nobody had an answer. Claire stepped in quickly. "You are refusing crew instructions." Marcus nodded once. "And you are refusing verification." The word struck harder than before because more people now understood exactly what he meant. Emily's camera captured every second. Jordan felt the pressure building from every direction. The passengers were watching. The captain was watching. The crew was watching. Most importantly, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Claire's composure began to crack. "You are creating a problem where none exists." Marcus looked around the cabin. Then he looked directly at her. "The problem existed before I boarded. I am simply the person who exposed it." Silence followed. Heavy, uncomfortable, absolute. Even the usual sounds of boarding seemed distant now. Then Emily spoke for the first time. He showed his ticket. Her voice was not loud, but everyone heard it. A businessman 3 rows back nodded. "That is what I saw too." Another passenger added, "Nobody ever checked the reservation." Claire's eyes widened slightly. The cabin was changing. Witnesses were becoming participants. People who had remained quiet were beginning to speak. Captain Hayes noticed it immediately. The situation was slipping beyond crew control. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Claire Donovan looked less certain than she had just a few minutes earlier. Marcus Whitfield looked down at the backpack resting alone in the aisle. For everyone else in the cabin, it was just a bag. For him, it was something else. It was a reminder that some experiences never truly disappeared, no matter how much success followed them. The voices around him seemed to fade for a moment. The cabin, the passengers, the tension, everything drifted into the background as an older memory surfaced. He was 22 years old again, standing inside a crowded airport terminal in Atlanta. Back then he owned nothing. No companies, no board seats, no private investments. Just a degree, a worn suitcase, and a one-way ticket to an interview he could barely afford to attend. He remembered arriving early that morning wearing the best clothes he owned. A clean shirt, pressed slacks, polished shoes. He remembered the gate agent looking at his ticket and then looking at him, then looking back at the ticket again. Not because anything was wrong, because something about him did not fit the image she expected. He remembered being questioned longer than everyone else. He remembered watching other travelers move through without hesitation while he stood there explaining himself over and over. The memory had stayed with him for more than 20 years. Not because of the delay, not because of the inconvenience, because of the feeling that he needed to prove he belonged before anyone would treat him like he did. The same feeling now sat quietly inside first class. Different airport, different decade, different bank account, same assumption. Marcus slowly lifted his eyes. Claire Donovan was still speaking to Captain Hayes. Brian Keller was still defending decisions that no longer made sense. Yet none of it surprised him anymore. Success changed many things. It changed addresses. It changed opportunities. It changed the size of rooms people invited you into. But it did not automatically change how every person saw you when you first walked through the door. That lesson had followed him his entire life. Across the aisle, Emily Brooks continued recording. Jordan Ellis stood frozen near the galley. The passengers watched. The crew watched. Nobody realized Marcus was no longer thinking about the seat. The seat itself had become irrelevant. What mattered now was the pattern. The pattern that generated complaint after complaint. The pattern hidden behind phrases like procedure, concern, and policy. Marcus had spent years building Aerolux into one of the fastest-growing airlines in America. He had invested billions of dollars into technology, training, customer experience, and safety. Yet sitting there now, he understood something painful. Culture could not be measured on a spreadsheet. Character could not be installed through software updates. Respect could not be purchased with corporate budgets. It had to be chosen, every day, by every employee. The realization settled over him with surprising calm. Not anger, not frustration, clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives when uncertainty finally disappears. Around him, the cabin still buzzed with tension. But inside Marcus, something had become perfectly still. The test was over. He already knew what he needed to know. The only thing left was deciding what to do with the truth. Marcus Whitfield reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The movement was so calm that almost nobody reacted at first. Claire Donovan certainly did not. She was still focused on controlling the cabin, still convinced that authority alone would carry the day. Captain Hayes remained near the front row, trying to maintain the appearance of order. Brian Keller stood beside him, arms folded, avoiding the growing number of skeptical looks coming from passengers. Marcus unlocked his phone and selected a single contact. Rachel Morgan, his executive assistant. The call connected almost instantly. "Good evening, Marcus," Rachel answered. Her voice was crisp and professional. "I assume the inspection is no longer routine." Several passengers exchanged curious glances. Claire rolled her eyes. "Another phone call," she muttered under her breath. Marcus ignored her. "Activate Protocol Blackwing." The words sounded simple. Yet Rachel's response came without hesitation. "Understood. Initiating executive review. Live incident documentation is now active. Legal, compliance, human resources, and corporate ethics are being notified." For the first time, Brian looked uncertain. Claire laughed softly. "You expect us to believe that?" Marcus continued as if she had never spoken. "Pull gate footage, boarding logs, scanner records, crew communication records, and passenger seating history." Rachel responded immediately. "Already in progress. Initial records confirm a valid boarding authorization and confirmed assignment for Seat 1A. Jordan Ellis looked up sharply. The confirmation matched exactly what he had witnessed. Emily Brooks lowered her phone slightly, listening carefully. Around the cabin, passengers were no longer whispering. They were paying attention. Every word mattered now. Claire crossed her arms. "Captain, this is ridiculous." But her voice sounded different than before. Less confident, less certain. Captain Hayes glanced toward Marcus's phone. Something about the conversation felt unusually specific, unusually professional. Rachel continued. "Board members have been alerted. Compliance is reviewing the live incident report. Estimated review time is under 10 minutes. Marcus nodded. "Keep the line open." "Of course," Rachel replied. "Would you like corporate security notified as well?" A silence settled over the front cabin. Marcus looked out the window for a brief moment before answering. "Not yet. Let us see how people respond when given an opportunity to correct themselves." Emily felt a chill run through her arms. The statement was not angry. It was not threatening. It was worse. It sounded like someone documenting a decision already made. Claire's smile disappeared. "Captain, we cannot keep delaying departure because of this." Marcus turned his attention back toward her. "This is not causing the delay." The cabin grew quiet again. "Your decisions are." No one responded, because no one could. Jordan felt the atmosphere shift once more. The confrontation had entered a new phase. Earlier, the crew controlled the narrative. Now evidence was beginning to enter the room. Facts were replacing assumptions. Records were replacing opinions. And somewhere beyond the aircraft, an entire corporate system was waking up and paying attention. Claire still believed she was dealing with a difficult passenger. Marcus already knew she was about to discover something very different. The atmosphere inside the cabin changed again when Rachel's voice returned through the phone. This time, there was no hesitation. Marcus, compliance has completed the first review. Every conversation stopped. Even passengers several rows back were listening now. Marcus remained seated. Go ahead. Boarding records confirm seat 1A was assigned to you at purchase, verified at check-in, verified at security transfer, and verified again at boarding. Jordan Ellis slowly closed his eyes. The confirmation matched exactly what he had been trying to tell everyone. Rachel continued. There is no system error. There never was. The words landed like a hammer. Claire Donovan immediately looked toward Brian Keller. Brian looked toward the floor. Captain Hayes said nothing. Around the cabin, passengers exchanged knowing glances. The uncertainty was disappearing. Evidence was taking its place. Emily Brooks kept recording. Her phone captured every reaction, every expression, every uncomfortable silence. Then Rachel added something that changed everything. Marcus, the board has requested identification confirmation before proceeding with the next phase. Marcus nodded once. Patch them through. A brief pause followed. Then a new voice entered the call. Older, confident, professional. Good evening, Mr. Whitfield. Captain Hayes froze. Brian looked up immediately. Claire's expression tightened. Marcus answered calmly. Good evening, Thomas. Thomas Reed was not just another executive. Every senior employee at Aerolux knew the name. He was chairman of the board. His voice coming through that phone changed the entire meaning of the situation. The board has reviewed the incident summary, Thomas said. We are standing by for your recommendation. The cabin went completely silent. Not quiet. Silent. Claire blinked. Brian stared openly now. Captain Hayes looked as though he had suddenly forgotten how to speak. Emily lowered her phone for a moment, trying to process what she was hearing. Marcus finally stood from seat 1A. Not quickly, not dramatically, just slowly enough that every person on the aircraft watched him rise. He picked up his backpack from the aisle and placed it calmly beside his seat. Then he looked directly at Claire. You asked me to leave a seat that belongs to me. Claire opened her mouth, but no words came out. Marcus turned toward Captain Hayes. You accepted assumptions instead of verification. The captain's face drained of color. Then Marcus looked around the cabin, at the passengers, at Jordan, at Emily, at everyone who had witnessed the last 30 minutes unfold. My name is Marcus Whitfield. The words echoed through the first-class cabin. I am the chief executive officer and controlling shareholder of Aerolux Airways. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The statement hung in the air like a shockwave. Richard Bennett's eyes widened. His wife covered her mouth. Emily stared at Marcus and then at her phone screen as if making sure she had recorded it correctly. Jordan felt relief and disbelief collide at the same time. Claire took a step backward. Brian looked completely stunned. Captain Hayes lowered his eyes. Marcus's voice remained calm. That was what made it so powerful. You did not remove a problem from first class. He looked directly at Claire. You tried to remove the person responsible for the airline itself. The silence that followed felt endless. Because in a single moment, every assumption made during the last half hour collapsed under the weight of the truth. For several long seconds, nobody in the cabin seemed capable of speaking. The revelation had drained the room of certainty. Claire Donovan stood motionless near the aisle. Brian Keller looked as though he were searching for an explanation that no longer existed. Captain Robert Hayes stared toward the floor, replaying every decision he had made during the last 30 minutes. Around them, passengers began processing what they had just witnessed. Emily Brooks lowered her phone and shook her head slowly. I knew something was wrong, she said quietly. The businessman seated behind her nodded. They never checked the facts. Another passenger added, they decided who he was before they knew who he was. The comments spread through the cabin like ripples across water. One by one, passengers stopped treating the situation like a dispute and started seeing it for what it had become. A lesson. Jordan Ellis stood near the galley with relief written across his face. The pressure that had been sitting on his shoulders since boarding finally began to lift. He had trusted what he saw. He had trusted the system. Most importantly, he had trusted the truth. Marcus remained calm. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. The moment was too important for that. Across the phone, Thomas Reed spoke again. Marcus, the board has reviewed the live footage, the scanner records, and the compliance report. Every crew member listened carefully. The findings are extremely concerning. Claire swallowed hard. Brian looked toward the emergency exit sign above the cabin, as though avoiding eye contact might somehow change reality. It did not. Thomas continued. Multiple opportunities existed to verify the reservation. None were used. Multiple employees observed confirmation records. Those records were ignored. The words landed with devastating precision, not because they were emotional, because they were factual. Facts leave very little room to hide. Captain Hayes finally spoke. Mr. Whitfield, I would like to apologize. Marcus looked at him. The captain's voice sounded sincere, but also exhausted. I should have verified the information personally. Marcus nodded slightly. You should have. No anger. No hostility. Just truth. Somehow that made it harder to hear. Claire attempted to speak next. I never intended. Marcus raised a hand gently. Not to silence her. To stop the excuses before they began. Intentions are not the issue. The cabin became still again. Marcus looked around at everyone watching. Character is revealed when nobody important appears to be watching. Emily felt chills at the statement. So did several other passengers. Because that was exactly what had happened. Claire believed she was dealing with an ordinary traveler. Brian believed the same thing. The captain trusted their judgment. Their actions had followed naturally from those assumptions. Marcus turned toward Jordan. You spoke when it mattered. Jordan looked surprised. I just told the truth. Marcus nodded. That is usually harder than people think. A few passengers began clapping softly. Then more joined them. Not loud, not dramatic, just genuine. The sound filled the first-class cabin. Claire looked down. Brian remained silent. Captain Hayes closed his eyes briefly. The applause was not for power. It was not for wealth. It was for dignity. And for the first time since boarding began, the entire cabin understood the difference. The applause faded slowly, leaving behind a silence far more powerful than the noise itself. Marcus Whitfield stood near seat 1A with his phone still in hand. Around him, passengers watched carefully. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Across the line, Thomas Reed spoke again. Marcus, the board is prepared to act immediately. Claire Donovan's shoulders stiffened. Brian Keller stared at the floor. Captain Robert Hayes remained motionless. The reality of the situation had finally arrived. Not as a rumor, not as a possibility, as fact. Marcus looked around the cabin one last time before responding. This is not about punishment. Several passengers exchanged glances. The statement surprised them. Marcus continued. It is about accountability. The words settled over the cabin like a final judgment. Thomas answered immediately. Understood. Marcus turned toward Claire first. You had multiple opportunities to verify the truth. Claire opened her mouth, then stopped. Every explanation sounded smaller now than it had 30 minutes earlier. Marcus continued. Instead, you relied on assumptions. Claire lowered her eyes. Then Marcus looked toward Brian. You supported decisions that were never supported by facts. Brian nodded once. He could not argue. The record was already documented. The passengers had seen everything. The system logs had confirmed everything. Marcus then turned toward Captain Hayes. Leadership carries responsibility. When people look to you for direction, you owe them verification before judgment. The captain accepted the criticism without protest. He knew it was deserved. Marcus brought the phone back to his ear. Thomas, effective immediately. I am requesting temporary suspension pending formal review for all crew members directly involved in this incident. A wave of silence moved through the cabin. Nobody seemed shocked. The outcome felt inevitable now. Thomas responded. Approved. Human Resources has already prepared the documentation. Claire's face lost what little confidence remained. Brian closed his eyes briefly. Captain Hayes remained composed, but the disappointment on his face was impossible to miss. Marcus continued. I also want a complete audit of first-class service complaints from the last 3 years. Every unresolved report, every escalation, every closed investigation. Thomas answered immediately. Already authorized. Emily Brooks listened carefully. She realized this moment was bigger than a single flight, bigger than a single crew. What began as one passenger being questioned had become an examination of an entire culture. Marcus looked toward Jordan Ellis. "You will be interviewed as part of the review." Jordan nodded. "Of course." Marcus allowed a faint smile. "Tell the truth exactly the way you did today." Jordan felt a mixture of relief and pride. For the first time all evening, he stood a little taller. Around the cabin, passengers watched the scene unfold with quiet respect. Nobody celebrated the suspensions. Nobody seemed happy about careers being disrupted. But everyone understood why it was happening. Accountability was not revenge. It was responsibility. Marcus finally looked around the aircraft one last time. "The problem was never that you did not know who I was." His voice remained calm. Every passenger heard every word. "The problem was how you treated someone you believed was unimportant." No one responded, because no one could. The statement cut straight through every excuse that remained. And in that moment, more than any policy, investigation, or suspension, the real lesson finally became impossible to ignore. Nearly 45 minutes after the aircraft was originally scheduled to depart, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt completely different. The tension that had dominated the evening was gone. In its place was something quieter. Reflection. Understanding. The boarding door remained open while replacement personnel were arranged and final reviews were completed. Most passengers stayed seated. Nobody seemed eager to leave. They had witnessed something far more memorable than an ordinary flight delay. Marcus Whitfield returned to seat 1 and placed his backpack beneath the seat in front of him. The same seat he had been told he did not belong in. The same seat that had revealed more about the company than months of reports ever could. Across the aisle, Emily Brooks finally lowered her phone. "I do not think I will forget this flight," she said. Marcus smiled politely. "Neither will I." A few nearby passengers laughed softly. The tension eased even further. Jordan Ellis remained near the galley, helping prepare the cabin for departure. He moved with a different confidence now, not because of what had happened to others, because he had learned something about himself. He had spoken when it mattered. Marcus noticed him and nodded. Jordan returned the gesture. No words were necessary. Sometimes integrity speaks loudly enough on its own. Outside the aircraft windows, the last traces of evening sunlight faded across the runway. Airport lights reflected against the glass. The world continued moving. Flights arrived. Flights departed. Yet inside this cabin, an important lesson lingered. Thomas Reed returned briefly to the call. "Marcus, the board appreciates your leadership during this situation." Marcus looked around the cabin before answering. "Then let us make sure we learn from it." Thomas agreed immediately. "We will." The call ended. For the first time all evening, complete silence settled over the front cabin. Not an uncomfortable silence, a thoughtful one. Marcus looked at the passengers around him. Different ages, different backgrounds, different destinations. Every one of them deserved the same thing when they boarded an aircraft. Respect, not because of wealth, not because of status, not because of titles, simply because they were people. He slowly stood one final time. Several passengers looked up. Marcus spoke calmly, without raising his voice. The seat was never the issue. Nobody interrupted. The issue was the belief that dignity belongs only to certain people. The words settled over the cabin. A uniform does not create character. A title does not create value. And a person's worth should never be measured by appearance. Emily nodded quietly. Jordan listened carefully. Several passengers exchanged thoughtful glances. Marcus continued. "The most important decisions we make happen before we know who someone is. That is when our values are tested." The cabin remained silent. Every person listening understood exactly what he meant. Then Marcus offered a final smile and returned to his seat. Moments later, the boarding door closed. The aircraft prepared for departure once again. But the real journey had already happened. It had begun with assumptions and ended with accountability. It had begun with judgment and ended with truth. As the aircraft finally pushed back from a gate, many passengers looked towards seat 1A1 last time. Not because a billionaire sat there, not because a chief executive officer sat there, but because they had witnessed a reminder that respect should never require proof, dignity should never depend on appearance, and the strongest form of power is not the ability to demand respect. It is the ability to uphold it for everyone.